Now that I have the pickup bleed wires threaded through the guitar, what we can do now is do some of the wiring. And what we want to do is do as much of the wiring outside of the cavity as we can, so that will help prevent accidental burning of the edges of the wood, as well as getting solder kind of splattered in places we don't want it to. So what we're going to do is we're going to start to assemble these potentiometers. I'm going to use my helping hands to do that. We're going to get the jack going and put the capacitor on the tone and wire, ground wire, and do a few other things to these potentiometers to get them ready. Once they're ready, then we can drop it in, and then there'll be a few more little connections that we'll have to make. So what I'm going to do on the stereo jack on each one of these terminals, I'm going to add a little bit of solder, just a way to get it kind of started, and kind of coat that just a little bit, just enough for these wires to connect. And see if I can get it on this side here. There we go. So now we're going to connect a few wires to the output jack. So what we want to do on the ring, we want to connect the white wire, which is going to be the furthest one to the left in this case, closest to the jack. And the sleeve, we're going to connect the black wire, which is going to be on the opposite side. The ring is where we're going to connect the ground battery wire. So let's go ahead and connect this first white wire here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of a kind of a hook to it using my tweezers, and that's going to make it kind of connect nicely. And then I'm going to grab my soldering iron, and I'm just going to lightly melt and connect it to that ring area. And I want the wires coming from that direction because that's how it's going to be installed in the guitar. And now I'm going to do the same thing with the black wire. It's going to connect to the sleeve. It's going to be this guy here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to ground the volume knob. We're going to take one of the outer lugs here and we're going to ground it to the back of the potentiometer. And there's a couple of ways you can do it. If you have some old pushback wire, what you can actually do is you can actually pull some of that middle wire out to use it as kind of a ground between this lug here and the back of the pot. Sometimes the lugs you can bend it back to touch this the casing, but in this case it's a little bit, the lug is not long enough. You can also do this, since we're going to be installing some capacitors, you can actually use some of the capacitor, the extra leg here, to use it to connect the lug to the back of the potentiometer. Since we don't need the entire length of this, it'll be fine. It's kind of like an extra little piece of wire here. So that's what we're actually going to do. I'm going to show you how to use this capacitor here. We want to put a little bit of solder on these terminals here, these lugs I should say. And I'm going to do it on all three of them because we're going to be wiring on all three of them as well. Then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this capacitor and I'm going to cut it off once I get it where I want it to be. And I don't need a lot. Again, this is going to be the outer lug. I'm just going to thread it through. So I'm just going to take it off about here. Now I'm going to add a little bit of solder right in there. So now we're going to attach the capacitor to the tone control. So we grabbed the other potentiometer, I got it set up here. We're going to take one of these legs, it doesn't matter which one you use, and if you have some extra shrink tubing you can use to protect these legs of the capacitor. So since I've already added a little bit of solder to these lugs, it's going to basically just going to melt it, and then I'm going to add it to this lug here. We do have a good connection for that. I'm going to hold it there. Great. Then I'm going to bend this side a little bit because I'm going to ground this to the back of the pot there to attach, just to protect it. And I'm going to add a little bit of solder I might use my tweezers to hold it. Now what I can do is I can cut this excess wire off. So now I'm going to take this blue wire here, I'm going to connect it to the outer lug, the white part that is, and then the ground part, the bare part, I'm going to ground to the back of the potentiometer. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to heat this, since I already have a little bit of solder on this, I can heat this up, and that thing is going to slip right through. I'm going to hold it steady. Now I'm going to ground that ground wire to the back of the potentiometer. So I'm just going to heat up a little bit here. I'm going to try to slip the solder underneath it, and that should bond nicely. I may need to get my tweezers in here just to hold the wire in place so it stays nicely connected. So I need to do the same thing. I need to connect this blue wire to the volume pot now. This one's going to be on the left lug here on the volume pot. Just going to heat that up. I'll kind of move this wire a little bit so it can reach over to connect to the back of the potentiometer. Solder this ground wire to the back of the potentiometer. Try to sneak some of that solder underneath the iron there. There we go. Great. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to attach the battery connection here. So all the red wires need to be soldered together. And what I'm going to do is, just like on the capacitor, I'm going to use a little shrink wrap to cover this up once I get this soldered. So it's real simple. We're going to twist it, and then we're going to solder the ends of the wires. This black wire is going to be going to our output jack, and we'll solder that to that connection as well. So I'm just going to twist these wires as tight as I can. This is where the helping hand is really helpful. And I'm just going to add a little bit of solder. Shrink tubings around here. I want to protect the end. I don't even have to necessarily shrink it, because this is a pretty tight fit and it should fit nicely. Now I'm going to connect the battery ground wire to the ring of this stereo jack here. I've threaded the battery through the output hole there. Same thing, I'm kind of having it angled the same direction as the other wires. Check all the wires, looking pretty good. I can thread these wires now back through the cavity. Now I'm going to add this plate here. I can actually screw it back. Now sometimes these things can be a little tight in here, so what you have to kind of sometimes do is find the right angle where that jack will just fit in nicely, and then I can tighten that up. Once I get the direction, I'm going to pull this out, and then I can do this further tightening. You want to be able to, when you tighten these jacks, you want to be able to hold one side of it. The wires could spin around, and you can actually rip off the wires. There we go. What we want to do now is I'm going to, just for as a reference, I'm going to put the pots in place here. And I'm really just want to measure the hot lead as well as the ground wire coming from the jack here, just to kind of get a ballpark. I'm going to have a little bit extra cable, so in case I need to move it around or just kind of get it out of the way. So roughly about here. So I'm going to trim a little bit right about here on this lead. And this ground, I'm going to connect it to the tone, the back of the tone pot. So I'm going to leave roughly about this much here. And what I'll need to do is I'll need to strip these wires here. Okay, got that one. All right, so then I'm going to go ahead and tin these wires because it's going to make it a little bit easier. And I'm going to very carefully get my iron in here and just tin a little bit there. Again, that'll make it easier to connect to the back of the pot. I have my bridge ground wire here. I'm going to put that underneath here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach my bridge ground wire to this location here. I'm also going to ground the pickup ground wires to this location as well as the opposite side here. Making sure everything is nicely heated up. Now I'm going to take these pots out. So I'm going to take this hot lead from the output jack and I'm going to connect it to this middle lug here. And just going to heat this up and try to move as quick as I can in here, making sure that both the both the wires and the lug are nicely heated. Now there's a little bit of excess wire sticking out. I'm just going to trim a little bit of that off. So I'm going to add these potentiometers to their location here in the body. And what I can do now is I can tighten these down to kind of keep them in place so when I solder they're not moving around. It makes it a little bit easier. So I'm just going to hold this and then thread that through just enough there's a kind of snug so they don't move around. So now I'm going to attach this ground wire to the back of the tone pot here, and there's enough solder here where it'll I don't need to add more. Now I want to attach the switch wires, both the ground as well as the hot lead there. We're working in a very confined space here, and I'm just going to heat up that lug, and it should just, because everything's kind of pre-tin, it's going to slide right through and connect nice and easily. And I'm going to hold it there for a second. I can bend that wire over just a hair, and I'm going to use my tweezers to hold against this pot here. I'm just going to hold it in there, and then I'm going to heat that up. And I'll probably hold both those wires just because I want to make sure neither wire lifts up off that pot. So now I'm going to attach the ground wire on the switch to the outer casing on this little spot right here. And it looks like I'm going to use a little bit more solder to help that out a little bit. Yeah, it's looking good. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to connect the pickup lead wires. So we have a couple options. We can keep them as close to their original length as possible. That'll allow us to be able to, if we decide we want to try these pickups in another guitar, we have plenty of extra wire that we can work with. But if you know you're going to keep the pickups in that particular guitar, it's best to trim this down as much as you can. That way the cavity is really clean, there's less chance of wires touching each other, shorting things out, that kind of thing. For now, what we're going to do, we're actually going to keep them in their original length, and we're just going to do the best we can to be able to wrap or place these wires when we put the cover on. I'm going to attach the bridge lead wire, and we have two connections we need to make. We need to make the hot lead to the second lug, if you remember, as well as the ground, and I'm going to ground it to the switch. The reason why I can ground it to the switch is because the switch that we just connected is grounded to the back of the volume pot. That's why I can get away with grounding it here. So we're going to start with the hot lead, and then I'm going to attach the ground afterwards. Since my wires are pre-tinned, I'm going to just heat the element up and then hold the wire the best I can in place. I probably don't need this much ground wire, so I'm just going to trim a little bit of that off. And then I'm going to take my tweezers here and I'm going to ground it to the same location as that bridge ground wire. Just heating up the solder. I don't need to add any more. Again, I want to make sure everything gets nicely heated together and melted. I want everything to bond correctly. Get that solder to kind of flow over everything, and that's looking pretty good. Then again, a quick little visual inspection. Now I'm going to attach the neck pickup. It's very similar to the bridge, so this should be pretty easy, straightforward. This one's a little bit different in the sense that it's the third lug over versus the second one. I want to make sure that I'm not accidentally disconnecting that little bridge wire between the second and third here. That bridge wire is really important. It's part of the operation of the switch. So again, I want to make sure that that stays connected. I'm going to heat that up. So now that it's dried, I'm going to actually, just like the bridge, I'm going to cut a little bit of this ground wire off. Great, it's looking good. Now I'm just going to heat up. Again, I'm coming down from this angle here, and I'm just going to heat up that ground joint here. And again, I want the solder to really flow and liquefy over everything. I have a great connection. It's looking really good. Excellent. So we're almost done. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to do the best I can to wrap these wires in here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my battery, okay? So I'm going to attach the battery to the clip here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some of the packaging here just to kind of shield it. You can use foam or something like that, but I'm just going to cover it up, and then I'm just going to lightly just lay it over here like this. That way the battery doesn't accidentally ground anything in the cavity. So we're looking good. Add the cover on here. And I'm only going to put a couple of screws in just because I want to test the guitar and make sure that everything is working properly, because if something's not working, then I can easily remove this